So I'm gonna be honest guys, after making this video, I will never take GPS for granted ever again. Number 5 on this list is the expeditions of Ernest Giles. Ernest Giles really only has himself to blame when it comes to his expeditions because he went on 4 separate ones. You'd think that he would have learned his lesson after the first one, but I guess not. Ernest Giles lived from 1835 to 1897 and was an explorer of Australia. Not much was known about Australia at this point other than the fact that it was pretty big. Ernest Giles wanted to shed some light on the country and made it his mission to explore the continent. His first expedition was in 1872 and was decently successful. Him and 2 other men wandered around the continent and discovered some interesting landmarks on the way. The second one wasn't nearly as well thought out though. Ernest set out on an expedition with 1 other man named Alfred Gibson. Apparently Alfred Gibson knew absolutely nothing about exploring in the desert though, so this was a pretty silly move to have this guy be your one partner. At the 8-month mark, the 2 were deep into the Australian wilderness when one of the horses died of thirst. This was pretty problematic and meant that one guy was either walking or getting left behind. Well, for Ernest, it was a little bit of both. Somehow they came to the conclusion that Alfred Gibson would take the horse and ride on ahead and Ernest would travel the rest on foot. The insane part about this though is that Ernest actually survived and Gibson didn't. Gibson was never heard or seen again and presumably perished in the desert. Whereas Ernest, after an 8-day walk with no food, carrying a massive cask of water on his back and hallucinating the entire way, managed to survive. The one piece of food that he had in the 8-day journey was a baby walleye, and he wrote in his journal that he pounced upon it, ate it, living, raw, dying, fur, skin, bones, skull, and all. Guys, I'm totally cool with going on the occasional hike, but that whole thing, that's a bit extreme for me. Number 4 on this list is David Livingstone's expedition. David Livingstone lived from 1813 to 1873 and was a Scottish physician and also an explorer of Africa. He was notably most fascinated with the Nile River and where it came from. That's why in 1866 he decided to set out with a group of local guides on foot to discover where this river actually originated from. Clearly Livingstone didn't conduct the hiring process well enough though, because these guides, they weren't to be trusted. They led him for a time, but soon started to become bored of this expedition and realized that they had all the power in this relationship. They abandoned him, with some of them even stealing a few of his supplies. When they got back to society and were asked about his whereabouts, they told everyone inquiring that he had just died in the jungle. This was a pretty bad situation for Livingstone to find himself in, but it actually gets a lot worse. He trekked through the jungle by himself for a time, but eventually had completely run out of supplies and had to get assistance from someone. Lucky for him, there were some passing slave traders that used this route often. Unluckily for him though, they brought him to the village of Bambara. Clearly the villagers here were not accustomed to seeing a white person and were pretty shocked by this. They responded by taking Livingstone and putting him into a zoo. That's right guys, David Livingstone was put into a roped off cage so that he could be an attraction for those passing through the village. Finally, someone who knew Livingstone heard of this man that was caged up and came to his rescue. When he got there though, Livingstone wasn't in the best shape. Extremely malnourished, crippled, and currently dying of malaria, he'd definitely seen some better days. He was saved from the cage, but didn't last too much longer after that, eventually dying from disease. This story just goes to show you that if you're gonna get a guide, make sure it's somebody that you can trust. Number 3 on this list is the South Pole Expedition. Sir Ernest Shackleton was an Anglo-Irish Antarctic explorer who lived from 1874 to 1922. After hearing about his 1914 expedition to Antarctica though, it's actually a miracle that this guy made it all the way to 1922. The explorer had the goal of making it across Antarctica. They'd intended to take a ship, land on the continent, and then trek across it to the other side. What they were going to do when they got to the other side is anyone's guess, but luckily they never even needed to worry about that part. No, the issues for them happened far earlier. As they were sailing to Antarctica, they started slowing down and slowing down and slowing down until they finally stopped completely. They realized that the water around them had turned to ice and they were now frozen in place. Rather than get out and walk it, they decided to wait until the ice thawed and then they would keep going. They apparently sat on that ship waiting for this to happen for 10 months though. Then at the 10-month mark, the ice didn't break and their ship just actually sank. So now we have this group of explorers without much supplies, stranded on the ice in the middle of an ocean. They were smart enough to save their lifeboat though and managed to take it and themselves to the nearest landmass. By this point, the expedition was completely ruined and now they just needed to focus on survival. They had to leave some men behind and Ernest and some other guys got got in a lifeboat and decided to sail it over 800 miles in the ocean. It should also be noted that this was during World War I, so if they ran into the wrong ship, then it could have all been over for them anyways. They made it to land, and then they realized that to get to people, they actually needed to climb an entire mountain range. And believe it or not, they actually did, and finally made it to some civilization on South Georgia Island. This expedition didn't lose as many men as some other ones, but pretty much anything that could go wrong did go wrong. The fact that anyone survived is truly pretty miraculous. Number 2 on this list is Ferdinand Magellan's expedition to the Philippines. So you probably remember the name Ferdinand Magellan from history class growing up. If you don't though, he was a Portuguese explorer best known for his expedition to the East Indies across the Pacific Ocean. The actual expedition resulted in completely new trade routes opening up and the discovery of the interoceanic passage. This was definitely a success, but it wasn't quite as nice for Magellan or most of his crew, to be honest. Out of the 260 people that left for this expedition in 1519, only 18 actually survived and made it back home 2 years later. The biggest problem that took most of the lives of these explorers was food supplies. Back then, no one had any idea how big the ocean actually was and how long it would take them to sail across it. Therefore, the food and water that they brought along with them was woefully insufficient in feeding 260 men for an extended period of time. Several months went by on the high seas and the supplies started to wear thin. With no sign of land in sight, the crew had to resort to drastic measures. It started with crumbs that were filled with maggots, then moved on to cooked leather that was on the boat, then went straight to sawdust, and then finally to any rats that they could find. This was just for food though. For drink, they had to have yellow water. I feel like I don't need to explain what that is, but I can promise you that it wasn't pretty. Many people died from disease and malnourishment on the boat before they finally reached the Philippines. Here, they were attacked by a bunch of natives and Magellan was stabbed in the face with a spear. So I suppose that you could argue that this expedition wasn't cursed since they actually did reach their destination, but 18 out of 260 is a pretty rough ratio of survivors, and drinking pee-pee water while eating boat leather? I mean, that doesn't sound too great either. Number 1 on this list is the Spanish expedition to the Gulf of Mexico. Back in the early 1500s, there was a craze in Europe for acquiring gold. This was especially true about the gold in the Americas, this magical new land of resources that had recently been discovered. Well, Alvar Núñez Cabeza de Vaca, and yeah, that's his actual real name, was a Spanish explorer who wanted to get in on the action. He decided to organize an expedition to America right around where Florida is, get his share of the gold, come back to Spain, and be a rich man. This didn't work out the best for him or countless men that he decided to bring along though. The Spanish explorer managed to round up about 600 other Spaniards to come along in this expedition for gold. They set off from Spain and actually managed to cross the Atlantic without too much of a hitch. When they got to what's now the Dominican Republic in a layover, they did lose roughly 100 of the men though. Now this wasn't too bad because they still had about 500 and the 100 men just decided that they were done with the mission and wanted to stay in the Dominican, but it was the beginning of the bad luck for the remaining crew. After leaving this layover, they immediately got hit with a massive hurricane which killed tons of men and lots of their horses. Then, when the remainder of the crew arrived in Florida, not only were lots of their supplies already lost, but they had to fight off countless waves of native attacks. They were losing miserably and had to get out, so apparently they broke down their weapons and supplies and tried to make some makeshift boats to get away from where they were. This actually worked for a little bit, right up until they got hit with another hurricane and fell into the sea. At that point, the roughly 80 men that survived this had to get to shore, but very quickly when they did, got enslaved by the native people that had been attacking them in the first place. 10 years later, 4 men managed to cross into a Spanish colony in Mexico, claiming that they were the only 4 men left from the initial expedition that set out a decade ago. 4 men out of 600. I have no idea what cursed this expedition, but this thing, it was doomed the second they left Spain. Well, there you have it guys, that is our list of the top 5 cursed expeditions that have haunted history. Please comment down below what you thought about this list, or if you're familiar with any other cursed expeditions that I may have missed. Thank you so much for watching. I've been your host Nicholas Playlog, and I'll catch you next time.